If you were listening to this right now, I want you to close your eyes for a second.
Unless you're driving, of course.
Right, yeah, please do not close your eyes if you're driving. But if you're safe at home, just picture ancient Tibet.
Just whatever first comes to mind.
Exactly. Conjure up that first image. And, you know, if you're like most people, you are probably picturing these isolated, very peaceful monasteries, right?
Oh, absolutely. Monks in maroon robes.
Yeah, meditating in snowy mountain retreats, just completely cut off from all the chaos and warfare of the outside world.
It's a very deeply ingrained image.
It's almost mystical. But what if you learned that if we just wind the clock back to the early Middle Ages, that image is not just a little bit wrong, but literally the exact opposite of reality?
It's completely backward.
Right. What if I told you that in the 7th and 8th centuries, Tibet was this incredibly aggressive, cosmopolitan, armor-clad military superpower?
A total juggernaut.
We are talking about an empire that absolutely dominated the Silk Road. I mean, they systematically crushed Chinese imperial armies.
And went toe-to-toe with the Arab Caliphate, which was expanding rapidly at the time.
It's wild. It completely shatters all those modern assumptions we tend to project backward onto the past.
Yeah, we really have this tendency to view historical geography through the lens of modern borders, and modern cultural stereotypes.
Oh, for sure.
But the historical reality of early medieval Central Asia is just completely different.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are pulling from this incredibly detailed, really eye-opening stack of sources.
Primarily drawing from Christopher the Beckwith's meticulous historical analysis.
Right, his work, The Tibetan Empire in Central Asia. And we're going to use these sources to guide you through the entire sweeping narrative arc of the Tibetan Empire.
And the very beginning.
Yeah, starting with its deeply mysterious prehistoric origins. And then we'll trace its explosive, highly calculated colonial expansion.
We'll dissect all those complex, shifting alliances on the Silk Road, too.
And finally, we'll examine its dramatic collapse.
Yeah.
So, in doing all of this, we are going to fundamentally redefine how you view early medieval Eurasian history.
But to properly set the stage for you, we kind of need to do a little mental housekeeping first.
Okay, lay it on us.
We need to completely erase the concept of the Dark Ages from our vocabulary.
Oh, right, because that's very Europe-centric.
Exactly. That term is a Western European construct that has absolutely no bearing on what was actually happening in Asia.
Makes sense.
We were looking at a period, so roughly 600 to 850 CE, where Eurasia was just intensely dynamic. It was this thriving, highly connected, transcontinental network.
And Tibet wasn't just sitting quietly on the periphery of this network, right?
Not at all. It was the geographical and political center of a massive geopolitical chess match.
So who are the players in this chess match?
Well, you had the Tang dynasty of China in the east.
Right.
The Umayyad and Abbasid Arab caliphates over in the west.
Oh, massive powers.
Yeah, and various really powerful Turkic federations up to the north. And then Tibet is sitting right there in the middle, asserting itself not as some subordinate, but as an absolute peer.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how Tibet evolved into this geopolitical superpower, we first have to understand who these people actually were. Right?
Which is surprisingly difficult.
Right. Where did they come from? Because according to our sources, this is a massive historical mystery.
It really is.
It seems like the deeper historians dig into it, the less certain they actually become. So I just have to ask, is it normal for an empire, this massive one that literally fought the Tang dynasty, to have such obscure, debated roots?
Well, it is unusual, but the obscurity here isn't just because the records are lost to time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's heavily compounded by modern political and linguistic frameworks that historians have sort of tried to force onto the region.
Okay, what do you mean by force onto the region?
So, for a long time, there has been this widely accepted theory of a Sino-Tibetan language family.
I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, the idea was that Tibetan and Chinese shared a common ancestral root. But the source text actually firmly rejects this.
Like, completely rejects it.
Yes. Beckwith points out that this classification is largely politically motivated.
Interesting.
It's an attempt to retroactively justify modern borders rather than something that's based on, sound comparative historical linguistics.
Wow. Okay, so if they aren't linguistically related to the Chinese, what does the Tibetan language actually look like to a linguist?
When you really look at the mechanics of early Tibetan, it is fascinatingly complex. Its verbal system actually has features that are highly reminiscent of Indo-European languages.
Indo-European, like European languages.
Yeah, it shares structural similarities with Germanic tongues, and it possesses this deeply entrenched Proto-Indo-Iranian vocabulary.
That is wild.
And at the very same time, its grammatical structure is highly agglutinative.
Hold on, let me pause you right there, because agglutinative is a pretty heavy piece of linguistic jargon.
Fair point.
Let me make sure I'm picturing this right. Are we talking about, like, linguistic Lego bricks?
Linguistic Lego bricks.
Yeah, where instead of changing a word entirely to change its tense or meaning, you just keep snapping prefixes and suffixes onto a root word to build a longer, more complex meaning.
That is actually the perfect analogy. Yes, linguistic Lego bricks.
Okay, cool.
You have a root word, and you just stack suffixes on it to indicate tense or pluralization or case without changing the root itself.
Right.
And this agglutinative structure points toward a relationship with Altaic languages.
Like what?
Think Turkish or Mongolian. And there's also a probable relationship with Burmese.
So just a huge mix.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The point is, Tibetan is an incredibly unique linguistic tapestry. So forcing it into a neat, tidy family tree with Chinese is scientifically highly problematic.
It's like finding a mysterious engine part,
Mm-hmm.
and realizing it has threads that fit a German car, but the electrical connections look like they belong in a Japanese motorcycle.
That's a great way to put it.
So if the linguistics are this messy, what about the actual written historical records? When is the absolute first time someone writes down a description of the people living on the Tibetan plateau?
Well, to find that, we actually have to look at Chinese records from roughly 4,000 years ago.
4,000?
Yeah, during the Shang dynasty, and the Sham oracle bone inscriptions.
Like oracle bones?
Yeah, these were literally turtle shells or animal bones used for divination.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And in those inscriptions, there are references to a nomadic pastoral people living to the west called the Qing.
The Qing.
Right. And what is really fascinating here is the etymology. The Chinese character used to write Qing is actually a combination of two other signs.
Which are?
Sheep and man.
Sheep man.
Yep.
Sheep man.
I mean, that is incredibly evocative. It paints a very clear picture of a society completely defined by its herds.
Absolutely.
But does the source text confirm that these sheepmen are the direct ancestors of the empire builders we're going to talk about? Actually, no. It specifically cautions against making that direct leap.
Oh, really?
Yeah. By the time we get to the 7th century CE, Chinese observers explicitly state that the Tibetans and the Qing were distinct, completely unrelated peoples. They had different languages and cultures, so the Qing might have lived in the region early on, but they aren't the Tibetans.
So where do we find the real root of the Tibetan name?
To find that, we actually have to look west to Greco-Roman writers.
Wait, Greco-Roman? Why would writers in the Mediterranean have any idea who was living up in the Himalayas?
Because of trade. I mean, even in antiquity, the Silk Road was moving whispers and rumors of distant peoples along with the physical goods.
That makes sense.
So Claudius Ptolemaeus, who we usually call Ptolemy,
The famous Hellenistic geographer.
right, in the 2nd century, he mentions a people he calls the Botai, or Bouts.
Okay.
And then later, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus places this exact same group on the slopes of high, isolated mountains.
Okay, so the Baoth.
Yeah. And this root name, Baut, was pronounced in late classical Chinese as something close to Puat.
Twat.
Exactly. And linguists trace how Puat eventually evolved into the word Baudad.
Bod.
Yeah, which is the actual native name that Tibetans use for themselves today.
Bod. Okay, so we have the linguistic puzzle, and we have the origin of the name filtering through ancient trade networks. But how do we get from scattered nomadic tribes to a centralized state?
Right.
Like, do the eventual emperors migrate in from the steppes the way the Mongols later do?
No, they don't. And this is a really crucial point. The sources indicate that the Yarlung dynasty, that's the family that would eventually forge this massive Tibetan empire.
Okay.
They are completely under Fakhthanis.
Meaning they're entirely native to the specific soil they rule?
Yes.
They didn't arrive as outside conquerors?
Exactly. But, while modern historians look at them as native warlords, their own internal mythology claimed a divine origin.
Well, of course. They always do.
Right. Their founding myth states that their early kings didn't just emerge from the local population, they descended directly from heaven.
Okay.
And more importantly, they didn't die.
They didn't die.
No, they were connected to the heavens by a literal sky rope.
A sky rope.
Yeah. So when an early king's time on Earth was done, he would simply climb the sky rope back to the celestial realm,
Wow.
leaving absolutely no physical body behind on Earth.
The sky rope. I mean,
Ah.
as a foundational myth, that is incredibly powerful.
Very convenient, too.
Right, because it solves a major political problem. If your king literally descends from the sky and ascends back up, nobody can question his legitimacy.
Exactly.
And there are no tombs to be looted or desecrated by rivals.
Yep.
But obviously you can't run an earthly empire on a sky rope.
Yeah.
How does the myth actually transition into recorded history?
The transition happens through a very specific, almost tragic myth concerning a king named Dragum Batsampo.
Dragum Batsampo.
Right. According to the legend, Dragum Batsampo got into a duel. And during the fight, his sky rope was inadvertently severed.
Oh no.
Yeah, and because the connection to heaven was cut, he became entirely mortal.
Just like that.
Just like that. He died, and he became the very first king to leave a physical corpse that had to be buried in a tomb on Earth.
That feels like such a profound metaphor.
It really does.
It's like the culture collectively acknowledging the exact moment their leaders stopped being divine, untouchable figures.
Yeah, and became flesh and blood politicians.
Right, guys who bleed, die, and need to build physical monuments just to be remembered.
Precisely.
So the rope is cut. The kings are mortal. Where exactly are these mortal kings starting out? I'm assuming it wasn't some glittering metropolis.
Oh, far from it. The historical, physical genesis of the empire is incredibly humble.
How humble are we talking?
They started in a small, agriculturally poor region called the Finba Valley. It's a tributary valley of the massive Brahmaputra River. The local leader was just a minor feudal lord named Ristagbu Snagzigs. I can just call him Lord Stagbu.
Lord Stagbu, got it.
He operated out of a fortified stronghold known as Tiger Peak Castle.
Cool name.
Very cool name. But his people were not wealthy horse-riding steppe warriors. They were impoverished farmers.
Really?
Yeah, the sources actually mention an ancient song from the region that complains about how originally this valley only had wheat.
Just wheat.
Right. Only much later was it surrounded with yaks.
And yaks are a big deal.
Oh, yaks were the ultimate symbol of wealth, mobility, and military logistics in this environment.
So they are starting from a position of profound disadvantage. But, I mean, in historical terms, that's often the secret ingredient.
It's a very common catalyst.
Right. Because if you are sitting in a wealthy, fertile river valley, you get complacent. You focus on art and luxury.
You don't want to rock the boat.
Exactly. But if you were freezing in a valley with nothing but wheat, you have a massive incentive to look at your wealthier neighbors and figure out how to take what they have.
Necessity breeds military innovation.
Exactly.
This is a classic pattern of imperial formation. Empires frequently erupt from marginalized, resource-poor peripheries.
Because they have to.
Right. Because they lack natural wealth, they are forced to develop highly organized, aggressive, and efficient military structures just to survive.
And then what happens?
Over generations, that survival mechanism turns into an engine of conquest. And that engine starts revving up with Lord Stagbu.
Okay, what does he do?
He decides to plot against his regional overlord. This was a tyrannical figure known as the Zinporje, who was apparently abusing his vassals and listening to corrupt advisors.
It's the classic origin story, the minor lord standing up to the tyrant.
Mm-hmm.
But Stagbu doesn't actually get to finish the job himself, does he?
No, unfortunately, Stagbu dies before his plot can mature.
So who takes over?
The actual execution of the rebellion falls to his son, Namri Slanmornasham. We can just call him Namri, the usurper.
Namri the usurper.
Yes. And Namri doesn't just defeat the tyrant, he succeeds brilliantly. He systematically conquers the surrounding rival valleys and unites the entire central region of the plateau.
Wow.
And here is a really fascinating twist of historical nomenclature. The ethnonym Bod, which, as we discussed, eventually becomes the name for all of Tibet.
Right.
It originally only referred to this specific, newly conquered central region.
I find the irony there absolutely amazing.
How so?
Because the early kings of the Yarlung dynasty considered themselves Southerners, right? Kings of a region called Spu.
Yes, exactly.
But after Namri conquers the central region of Bod, they just take the name of the conquered territory.
They adopt it completely.
It's as if the Romans, after conquering Gaul, decided to start calling their entire empire Gaul.
That's a great comparison.
The very name Tibet was essentially acquired by a process of internal conquest.
It really demonstrates how fluid identity was during state formation. But, having unified this central region, Namri has created a unified, vigorous new state.
And I'm guessing they don't just stop there.
Nope. Immediately, almost by geopolitical reflex, this new Tibetan state starts looking outward.
Right, because once you unify the local valleys, you need wealth to reward your loyal generals. You can't build a global empire on barley and yak milk.
You definitely cannot.
You need silver, you need silk, and most importantly, you need access to the massive markets of Sui and later Tang, China.
The real wealth.
But as they look northeast toward those lucrative trade routes, they hit a massive roadblock.
They do. To the northeast, specifically around the Koko-Nor region.
What's the Koko-Nor region?
It's a massive salt lake that acts as a sort of gateway to the Chinese frontier. And there was a powerful nomadic Mongolic state.
Okay.
The Tibetans called them the Aya, and the Chinese records referred to them as the Tu Hun.
Let's stick with the Aya.
Okay, the Aya. They were acting as a buffer state, a highly profitable middleman controlling the flow of trade between the plateau, the steppes, and China.
So they're taking a cut of everything.
Exactly. So if Tibet wanted to project power and get to those markets, the Aya had to be dealt with.
And this brings us into the 600s, to the era of Sron Bitsan Sgampo, who is known as the Great Unifier of Tibet.
A legendary figure.
And reading about this guy, I mean, he is a masterclass in ruthless Machiavellian statecraft.
He really is.
He doesn't just rely on brute force cavalry charges. He uses diplomacy as a weapon, specifically matrimonial diplomacy, but in the most aggressive, weaponized way imaginable.
It's fascinating.
Let's look at how he secures his western flank before dealing with the Aya in the east. He marries his sister, a woman named Sad Markar, to the king of a neighboring state called Shengsheng.
Right. And in the traditional framework of medieval diplomacy, giving your sister in marriage is meant to cement an alliance, right? To create familial bonds of peace.
Right, everyone's family now.
But Sron Bitsan Sgampo inverted that completely.
How so?
Sad Markar wasn't sent to be a peacemaker. She was essentially an operative.
Like a spy.
More like an assassin's handler. Acting on coordinated instructions from her brother, she intentionally led her unsuspecting husband, the king of Shangsheng, into a carefully laid ambush.
Oh my God.
Yeah, where he was assassinated.
It is stunningly cold-blooded.
Very.
But the mechanics of what happens next are what really matter, right?
Yeah.
Because killing a king doesn't automatically give you his empire.
Mm-hmm.
How did Sron Bitsan Sgampo actually leverage that assassination?
Well, with the king dead and the Shangsheng leadership decapitated, Sron Bitsan Sgampo immediately moved his forces in.
To conquer them.
But not just to occupy the land. He wanted to absorb the Shangsheng armies directly into his own military apparatus.
Ah, sorry.
He integrated their cavalry, their resources, and their strategic territory. So this secured his rear and gave him the demographic and military critical mass he needed to turn east.
Okay, so his western flank is completely secure. He has absorbed a rival army. Now he turns his sights on China.
Here we go.
He sends an envoy to the Tang dynasty, specifically to Emperor Taizong, and he demands a Chinese princess for a marriage alliance.
A bold move.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Taizong refuses. And from the Chinese perspective, it makes perfect sense. The Tang favored the Aya buffer state. They had existing relationships there.
They didn't want to upset the balance.
Exactly. So how does Sron Bitsan Sgampo react to this diplomatic rejection?
He doesn't take it well.
He doesn't send a strongly worded letter. He mobilizes this newly integrated massive army and absolutely devastates the Aya buffer state,
Just crushes them.
driving their people into a panic, and then he marches his army directly onto the Chinese border itself.
It is a textbook example of coercive diplomacy, executed flawlessly.
Coercive is one word for it.
He recognizes that the Tang emperor only respects strength. By crushing the Aya, he removes the buffer, exposing the Chinese frontier to an immediate direct threat.
So the emperor has to deal with him.
Exactly. He proves his military capability so overwhelmingly that Emperor Taizong is forced into a strategic calculus.
I have to stop and marvel at the sheer audacity of this.
It's pretty wild.
It's essentially like knocking down your neighbor's fence, trampling their prize-winning garden, setting their shed on fire, and then standing in the smoking ruins demanding to marry their daughter as a peace treaty.
That is vividly accurate, yes.
But the craziest part of this historical narrative is that it actually works.
It worked precisely because the Tang court was pragmatic. In 641, the Chinese relented and sent Princess Wenqing to Tibet.
Wow.
Now, to modern sensibilities, rewarding an attacker with a princess seems like a massive concession, perhaps even a sign of weakness.
Right. If you are sitting there listening to this, you have to be wondering, does this prove that the mighty Tang dynasty, arguably the most powerful centralized empire on the planet at that time, was secretly terrified of this new Tibetan military machine?
Well, terrified is probably the wrong word. The Tang court in the 640s was highly confident, but they were also managing a massive empire with multiple active
Oh,
frontiers.
they were busy.
Very busy. Emperor Taizong recognized a strategic reality. The Tibetans had completely outmaneuvered the Aya, attempting to deploy massive, slow-moving Chinese infantry armies deep into the high-altitude terrain of the Tibetan borderlands would be a logistical nightmare.
And vastly expensive.
Exactly. For the Tang, giving up a princess of the royal house was actually a remarkably cheap price to pay to temporarily pacify a dynamic, aggressive neighbor.
It's a pragmatic trade-off.
It allowed China to save face diplomatically while focusing their military resources on their northern borders against the Turkic Khaganates and their eastern campaigns in Korea.
It's the cost of doing imperial business.
Yeah.
But sending Princess Wencheng wasn't just a political transaction. It ended up being a massive cultural watershed for Tibet, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The arrival of Princess Wencheng, and it should be noted shortly before her, a Nepalese princess was also brought to the Tibetan court.
So two foreign princesses.
Right. They introduced profound, lasting cultural influences. They brought artisans, technologies, and most significantly, Buddhism.
So this is the beginning of Tibetan Buddhism.
Yes. Now, it didn't convert the population overnight. Initially, it was strictly a court religion, fostered by these foreign princesses, their personal retinues, and the visiting foreign merchants they attracted.
Okay, so a top-down thing.
Exactly. But it laid the intellectual foundation for what Tibet would eventually become.
But while the Tang thought they were buying lasting peace with a marriage, they miscalculated.
Severely miscalculated.
They hadn't bought peace. They had simply given the Tibetans breathing room. They bought the Tibetans time to organize their administration, integrate their new technologies, and prepare for the next, far more explosive phase of expansion.
And that transition to the next phase happens under dramatic circumstances.
What happens?
Sronbitsan Skampo, the great unifier, dies around 650 CE,
Okay.
and he leaves behind a child heir, his grandson.
Oh boy. And if you read any history, you know that a child heir is usually the death knell for a newly formed empire.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It almost always results in internal civil war, the generals fighting for regency, and all the newly conquered territories rebelling. But Tibet manages to bypass this entirely. How do they survive a child emperor?
They survive because power consolidates smoothly into the hands of a remarkably capable, brilliant family of prime ministers, the Mughal clan.
The Mughal clan?
Yes. Specifically, a man named Mughal Stone Surtson becomes the de facto ruler of the empire. He acts as regent, and he is just a military and logistical genius.
Okay.
And under the leadership of the Mughal clan, Tibet makes a crucial geopolitical pivot.
What do?
They turn their gaze entirely away from the internal politics of the plateau, and they focus the entire output of their military machine onto the absolute heart of global wealth,
Which is?
the Tarim Basin.
Let's paint a picture of the Tarim Basin for the listener, because it's vital to understand what was at stake here.
It's the crown jewel.
We are talking about the core artery of the Silk Road. This isn't just empty desert. This is a string of heavily fortified, incredibly wealthy oasis city-states.
Places like Khotan, Kashgar, Kucha, and Aksu.
Right. The Tang dynasty understood the value of this region. They had spent decades and an unbelievable amount of blood and treasure securing what they called the 4 garrisons of the pacified West.
Controlling those garrisons meant controlling transcontinental trade,
It was the economic engine of Asia.
and the Mengar clan systematically dismantles that Chinese control.
Oh.
Well, they don't just raid, they execute a long-term strategy of conquest. First, in 663, they return to the Aya buffer state and finish the job.
The ones they had already crushed.
Yeah, they completely eliminate them. The Mongolic Khagan and his Chinese princess are forced to flee into exile in China, and the Tibetans permanently annex the territory.
So they removed the final barrier.
Exactly. Then the real earthquake happens. In 670, Tibet launches a massive, highly coordinated offensive straight into the Tarim Basin.
They don't just march in. They start taking these massive, heavily fortified cities. They capture Khotan. They take Aksu.
It's a blitzkrieg.
Now, Tang China obviously panics. You can't just let an upstart mountain empire steal your most lucrative colonial possessions.
No, you have to respond.
So the Tang mobilize a massive imperial army and march out to stop the Tibetans. They meet at the Jima Gol, a river valley in the Koko Nor region, which the Chinese records call the Battle of Tafechuan.
A massive collision.
So what exactly happens when these two huge forces finally collide?
So the result was just a catastrophic military disaster for the Tang dynasty, like absolute annihilation.
Really, complete annihilation.
Yeah, the Tibetan army, led by the Mingar clan, completely wiped out the Chinese imperial forces. And we know exactly how devastating it was because of the Chinese sources themselves.
How so?
Well, Chinese court historians are usually incredibly adept at minimizing their losses.
Right, using euphemisms like the army suffered a setback.
Exactly. But regarding Tafechuan, they bluntly admit that the Tibetan forces wiped them out.
Wow, they couldn't spin it.
No. And as a direct result of this single battle, the Tang military infrastructure in the West completely collapsed.
It's going.
They were forced to entirely abandon the four garrisons. They packed up their colonial administration, abandoned the oasis cities, and retreated.
I want the listener to really grasp the scale of this.
Yeah.
We're talking about Tibetan armies projecting military power hundreds and hundreds of miles off their high-altitude plateau, operating in harsh deserts, successfully besieging fortified Silk Road cities, and utterly destroying the primary field army of the Tang dynasty.
It's an incredible feat.
Logistically, how on earth were they achieving this? We established they started in a poor valley with wheat and yaks. How do you supply a massive army that far from home in the 7th century?
Well, the secret to their logistical success was their incredible adaptability and their administrative ruthlessness.
Okay, unpack that.
The Tibetan military machine didn't fight like the Chinese. The Chinese relied on massive, slow-moving baggage trains that extended for miles, carrying grain from the heartland.
Which makes them incredibly vulnerable to ambushes,
Yeah.
right?
Highly vulnerable. The Tibetans traveled light. They relied heavily on hardy mountain ponies and yaks, which could survive on really sparse forage.
So they don't need huge supply lines.
Exactly. Furthermore, they didn't try to supply their army entirely from Tibet.
What did they do?
When they conquered a city like Khotan, they immediately instituted a system of heavy taxation and conscription.
They lived off the land.
And the people. They incorporated Khotanese troops, who obviously knew the local terrain and how to fight in the desert, directly into their vanguard.
So they are essentially fueling their war machine with the resources of the people they are conquering.
Yes.
It's a self-sustaining wave of expansion. And for decades, the Mgar clan maintains this. The next generation of the family takes over, particularly a brilliant general named Mgar Kri Brin.
A tactical genius.
He spends years defending these newly won conquests, repeatedly defeating Chinese armies that attempt to push back into the Tarim Basin. He fortifies the mountain passes, controls the river valleys, and just chokes off Chinese counterattacks.
He was a wall.
Looking at their dynamic, I compare the Mgar clan to the shoguns of Japan.
That's a really good analogy.
They are the military dictators, right?
Mm.
The brilliant tactical minds out on the frontier, while the emperor sits on the throne in the capital at a figurehead.
Exactly.
But as is always the case in history, the most dangerous threat doesn't come from the enemy army. It comes from the paranoid politicians back home.
It almost always does. This dynamic exposes the fatal structural flaw of many early empires, the intense tension between a highly successful, heavily mobilized frontier military and a central court that feels increasingly alienated and threatened by that success.
Right.
To maintain the empire in the Tarim Basin, the Midgar clan required the Tibetan army to remain mobilized indefinitely.
It's expensive.
And it caused massive domestic friction. Nobles were tired of taxes, families were tired of their sons being away on endless campaigns.
And meanwhile, the figurehead emperor, Kri Disran, is growing up.
Yes, he is.
He is no longer the child who needed a regent. He becomes a young man, and he deeply resents the fact that the Mgar clan holds absolute power while he is confined to ritual duties.
He wants his power back.
So, in 699, he makes his move. But he doesn't just, fire his prime minister. He literally marches his own royal army against his own most successful general.
It is a moment of profound internal crisis. General Mgar Kri of Brin, rather than engaging in a full-scale civil war against his sovereign, which, would have torn the empire apart from the inside, makes a tragic choice.
What does he do?
He commits suicide.
Wow.
Yeah. His surviving family members and the thousands of loyal, battle-hardened troops who served under them see the writing on the wall. They flee across the border into China.
And the Tang dynasty must have been absolutely thrilled.
Oh, they welcomed them with open arms. The Tang court immediately enlisted these defecting Tibetan generals and troops, using their intimate knowledge of Tibetan tactics against their former homeland.
I have to push back on the emperor's logic here.
Go ahead.
By essentially decapitating his own most successful military family and driving his best generals into the arms of his sworn enemy. Didn't Emperor Kriosron just shoot his own empire in the foot at the exact moment they needed unity the most?
In the short term, the strategic cost was incalculable. It was a massive brain drain of military leadership.
Right.
The emperor secured his absolute domestic power, but he sacrificed the strategic genius that had built the empire. And the timing, as you mentioned, could not possibly have been worse.
Why?
Because with the Magar clan gone, Tibet's outward momentum briefly stalls. And it stalls precisely at the moment a completely new, terrifyingly powerful geopolitical player arrives from the distant west.
Right. We are now entering the early 700s, and the Silk Road is about to transform from a two-way border dispute into a massive three-way continental tug-of-war.
Exactly.
Because while Tibet and China have been fighting over the eastern half of the Silk Road, the Umayyad Arab Caliphate has been exploding out of the Middle East, conquering everything in its path.
A completely new factor.
And under their brilliant, aggressive governor, Qutayba bin Muslim, the Arab armies are pushing deep into Central Asia. They are subduing the wealthy, independent city-states in regions like Sogdiana and Takharistan.
Which is what we would today call modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan.
Right. So set the scene for us.
The geopolitical landscape of Central Asia in the early 8th century is perhaps one of the most complex and fascinating in world history.
Okay.
You have the Tang Chinese pushing westward, desperate to regain the lucrative garrisons they lost to the Mughal clan.
Tang from the east.
Right. You have the Arabs pushing eastward, fueled by the momentum of Islamic expansion and the desire to control the western half of the Silk Road.
Arabs from the west.
And you have the Tibetans pushing northward from their high plateau, determined to maintain their grip on the trade routes and keep the other two powers separated.
And the inevitable happens. They all crash into each other.
A massive collision.
By the year 715, armies from the Arab Caliphate, the Tang dynasty, and the Tibetan Empire literally converge in the Fergana Valley. I want the listener to really picture this. It is an absolute milestone in Eurasian history.
It really is.
The three greatest, most heavily armed expansionist states in the world are colliding in one mountain valley. Now, if you are a local Silk Road king, say the ruler of Fergana or prince in Sogdiana, how do you even survive?
Very carefully.
How do you maintain your kingdom when three different superpowers are using your backyard as a geopolitical wrestling ring?
Well, for the local rulers, survival required a constant, dizzying, and incredibly dangerous game of shifting allegiances.
I can imagine.
There was no neutrality. The local kings would send frantic embassies in all directions, to the Tang Emperor in Chang'an, to the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, and to the Tibetan Emperor in Lhasa.
Just begging for help.
Begging for military aid, offering tribute, and promising loyalty to all of them simultaneously. And what is truly fascinating here, and what Beckwith's sources really highlight, is the sheer adaptability of the Tibetans in this environment.
How so?
They were absolute masters of realpolitik.
And we have to clarify what realpolitik means here, because modern audiences often view medieval history through the lens of religious wars, right? Like the Crusades, jihads.
Right.
But in 8th century Central Asia, religion played almost zero role in how these empires formed alliances, right?
Practically none. It is a very common misconception that this era was defined by a clash of religions.
So what was it about?
For the Tibetans, Arabs, and Chinese, it was entirely about trade routes, controlling strategic mountain passes, and maintaining a balance of power. The religious affiliations were totally secondary to survival and profit.
Wow.
Depending on the year, the specific valley being fought over, and the strategic need, the Buddhist Tibetans would readily form military alliances with the Islamic Arabs against the Chinese.
Makes sense.
Or just a few years later, they would completely pivot and ally with shamanistic Turkic federations, like the powerful Turmish, to attack the Arabs.
The perfect example of this brutal pragmatism is the famous Day of Thirst in 724. Walk us through how that played out.
The Day of Thirst is a prime example of Tibetan-backed proxy warfare.
Oh.
The Arab governor of Khorasan had launched an expeditionary army into the Fergana Valley to assert control, But a massive army of the Turkic Federation, heavily supported and coordinated by the Tibetans, moved to intercept them.
So the Tibetans are backing the Turks.
Exactly. And the Turgesh and Tibetans didn't just meet them in open battle, they used the harsh geography against them.
How?
They harassed the Arab columns, cut off their supply lines, and forced them into a desperate retreat through the arid desert regions.
Oh, the Day of Thirst.
Right. The Arab army was routed, suffering massive, devastating casualties primarily from thirst and ambushes. The Tibetans were playing a grand strategic game here, ensuring that neither the Arabs nor the Chinese could ever gain total hegemony over the Western trade routes.
And to play that game, the physical feats the Tibetan armies were executing are just staggering.
Unbelievable.
We are talking about Tibetan infantry and cavalry marching out of their homeland, crossing the Pamir Mountains, which are literally known as the roof of the world.
Featuring some of the highest, most unforgiving mountain passes on Earth.
Just to fight tactical battles in modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, they're fighting at altitudes where most flatland armies couldn't even breathe, let alone swing a sword.
Let alone march an army over.
And while they are executing these logistical miracles, they are treating the Tang dynasty with a level of diplomatic arrogance that drives the Chinese court absolutely crazy.
Oh, it infuriated them.
Our sources note they insisted on using enemy country protocol. Explain to the listener why that specific phrase was such a massive insult to China.
So to understand the insult, you have to understand the medieval Chinese worldview.
Okay.
In Tang diplomatic theory, there were no equal nations. The Tang emperor was the supreme sovereign of the world, ruling by the mandate of heaven.
So everyone else is beneath him.
Exactly. Every other nation, kingdom, or empire on Earth was considered a vassal. If you sent diplomats to Chang'an, you were expected to bring tribute and perform rituals of submission, acknowledging Chinese superiority.
You had to bow down and admit you were the junior partner.
Exactly. But the Tibetans absolutely refused to play that game. By demanding enemy country protocol, the Tibetan emperor was communicating with the Tang emperor as an absolute equal.
Oh, wow.
It was a formal diplomatic declaration that said, "We are a peer empire, we do not submit to you, and we will negotiate only on equal terms."
That must have been a shock to the system.
It totally shattered the Chinese cosmological worldview. It deeply offended the Chinese court, and it constantly fueled the expansionist faction in Chang'an.
The Hawks.
Right. The Hawks who demanded war against Tibet simply to punish the insolent aliens and restore the proper order of the world.
They didn't bow properly, therefore we must send an army. It's the classic thin-skinned imperial excuse.
Pretty much.
But this three-way pressure cooker in Central Asia, the shifting alliances, the massive armies, the constant maneuvering, it couldn't last forever.
No, it was unsustainable.
And in the mid-8th century, the pressure finally blows the lid off. We hit the 750s, which is essentially a global geopolitical earthquake that completely levels the playing field and shatters the old world order.
Historians look at the 750s as arguably one of the most critical, transformative decades in world history.
What's happening?
You have three massive continent-shaking upheavals happening almost simultaneously across Eurasia.
Okay, let's go through them.
First, in the Islamic world, the Umayyad dynasty is violently overthrown by the Abbasid revolution in 750.
That's huge.
Yeah, this shifts the center of the Islamic world from Damascus to Baghdad. It pulls their focus closer to Central Asia, but also requires massive internal consolidation.
So I distracted.
Very. Second, in 751, you have the famous Battle of Talis, where a coalition of Arab and Qarluk Turk forces decisively defeat a massive Tang Chinese army.
The Tang lose again.
Yes. And this battle permanently halted Chinese westward expansion. China would not project power that far west again for 1,000 years.
Wow.
And then the absolute fatal blow to the Tang dynasty. The catastrophic An Lushan rebellion breaks out in 755.
Let's contextualize the An Lushan rebellion for the listener, because it is the crack that breaks China wide open.
It is devastating.
And Lushan was a hugely powerful Tang general who essentially went rogue and marched his armies against his own emperor.
Right.
It sparked a civil war inside China that was so devastating, so incredibly bloody, that it decimated the population and completely gutted the Tang military.
The emperor was desperate.
The emperor was forced to recall all of his elite frontier armies back east just to fight his own rebellious generals and save his throne. And Tibet, sitting in the mountains watching this happen, takes ruthless, absolute advantage of this massive power vacuum.
This is the era that marks the absolute zenith of the Tibetan Empire.
This is peak Tibet.
Yes. With China bleeding internally, its western borders completely undefended, Tibet expands aggressively and rapidly. They sweep out of the mountains and occupy vast swaths of Chinese territory.
And then they go for the ultimate prize.
They do. In 763, the Tibetan army achieves what is arguably the ultimate military and psychological victory.
They march east.
They march east, bypass the remaining Chinese defenses, and capture Chang'an, the capital city of Tang, China.
They took the capital.
Yes. The Chinese emperor literally has to flee his own capital in terror, and the Tibetans briefly install their own puppet emperor on the Chinese throne.
Now, capturing the enemy's capital is an incredible achievement. It is a dream of every conquering army.
Unimaginable prestige.
But they didn't hold Chang'an for long. They withdrew after a few weeks. So I have to challenge this a bit.
Okay, what's the challenge?
Was capturing the capital actually the peak of their sustained imperial power? Or was it just a really successful, massively scaled punitive raid? Like a calculated strike designed to humiliate China and loot the treasury rather than a serious attempt at occupation?
Well, it was a highly calculated strategic maneuver, far more sophisticated than a simple raid.
How so?
The Tibetan command recognized that permanently occupying a massive, hostile foreign capital like Chang'an, which was located deep in the lowlands far from their logistical power base, was unsustainable.
They'd be cut off.
Exactly. They would have been surrounded by Chinese counterattacks eventually. Instead, they used the terrifying psychological impact of capturing the capital to draw a hard, permanent border on their own terms. When they withdrew, they didn't just go back to the mountains. They formally occupied the Gansu corridor and the surrounding, highly strategic Western Chinese prefectures.
So they basically annexed the entire western doorway into China.
Exactly. They essentially constructed an intercontinental toll booth across Asia. Tibet entirely cut China off from the West.
An iron curtain.
An iron curtain.
Wow.
If Arab merchants, Persian traders, or Indian monks wanted to travel to or trade with China, they could no longer use Tang-controlled roads.
They had to go through Tibet.
They now had to negotiate passage, pay massive tariffs, and travel exclusively through Tibetan or Uyghur-controlled territory. Tibet didn't just defeat China militarily, they isolated them economically.
And they didn't just expand to the east. They looked south and subjugated the powerful, wealthy kingdom of Nanchao, located in modern-day Yunnan.
Yes.
They totally redominated the Tarim Basin in the north. They were extracting wealth from every single direction.
And this raises a fascinating avenue for historical speculation.
Oh, I love a good historical what-if.
When you look at the map in the late 8th century, you have to consider how incredibly close the Tibetan Empire came to permanently shifting the cultural and political gravity of East Asia.
What do you mean?
By completely neutralizing Tang China as a Western-facing power, Tibet became the dominant arbiter of trans-Eurasian communication.
Right.
If the An Lushan rebellion had dragged on longer, completely fracturing China into permanent warring states, or if the Tibetan Central Command had maintained its internal unity, we might be looking at an East Asian history fundamentally shaped by Tibetan rather than Chinese imperial structures.
It's an incredible what-if.
Yeah.
But as we see with all great empires, from Rome to the Mongols, the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets.
Gravity always wins.
Tibet is now the undisputed master of massive territories, stretching from the Himalayas to the Chinese plains, from the deserts of Xinjiang to the borders of India. But that size becomes their worst enemy. The periphery begins to bleed the center dry.
It does.
We are now entering the long twilight and the ultimate fall of the empire, a period stretching from the 790s down to the final collapse around 866 CE. What begins to crack the foundation?
It is the brutal economics of overextension.
Too much land, not enough people.
Exactly. Maintaining an empire of that unprecedented size across the most unforgiving, geographically diverse terrain on Earth requires constant, exhausting military mobilization.
And that costs money and lives.
And wars of attrition take a massive demographic and economic toll. In the north, around the Tarim Basin and the Tian Shan Mountains, Tibet finds itself locked in brutal, drawn-out wars with the Uyghur Turkic Empire, who are competing for the exact same trade routes.
Okay, so pressure in the north.
Right. And the west, around Samarkand and Kabul, they're continuously clashing with the armies of the Abbasid Caliphate.
They're fighting multi-front wars thousands of miles apart. And when you are stretched that thin, your vassals start smelling the weakness, right?
They always do.
In 794, the southern kingdom of Nanchao, which Tibet had subjugated, decides the Tibetans are distracted, and they defect back to an alliance with China.
A huge blow.
That immediately weakens Tibet's southeastern flank, forcing them to divert precious troops from the north to deal with the rebellion.
Shuffling troops around.
And then a massive, unpredictable external shock hits in 840. The Uyghur Empire, Tibet's great rival in the north, completely collapses.
Overnight, almost.
But it's not Tibet that destroys them. They are invaded by a fierce group called the Kyrgyz from the Siberian steppes.
And that Uyghur collapse is disastrous for Tibet.
Why? Wouldn't they be happy their rival is gone?
You'd think so, but no. It sends massive waves of desperate Uyghur refugees spilling south, pouring across Tibetan borders.
A refugee crisis.
Exactly. It completely destabilizes the northern frontier, introducing chaos, displaced populations, and unpredictable raiding into territories Tibet was already struggling to hold.
It's a classic domino effect of geopolitical instability.
The external pressures are mounting to an unbearable degree. But the fatal blow, as is so often the tragic case in imperial history, comes from within.
What happens?
In 842, the Tibetan emperor, a man named Gland Dharma, is assassinated.
And the detail of this assassination is just wild.
It's very cinematic.
He isn't killed by a rival general or poisoned by his wife. He is assassinated by a Buddhist hermit named Lalund Palji or Dorje. It sounds like something straight out of a martial arts movie.
Yeah.
But why a hermit? I thought we established that religion wasn't a major driver of their politics.
Internationally, religion didn't dictate their foreign alliances. But domestically, by the 9th century, religion and politics had become entirely intertwined.
Oh, I see.
The Tibetan court was deeply divided into vicious factions. You had the powerful Buddhist monastic establishment, which had amassed massive estates and wealth.
And they were probably exempt from taxation.
Often exempt, yes.
Yeah.
And on the other side, you had the traditional aristocratic families, many of whom favored the older native religious traditions, often broadly termed Bon.
Okay, so a huge power struggle.
Gland Dharma was perceived by the Buddhist faction as a persecutor. They saw him as a king trying to strip the monasteries of their wealth and power to fund his failing wars.
Because the assassination wasn't random.
No, the hermit's assassination of the emperor was a desperate, violent political act wrapped in religious justification.
And with the emperor dead, and the succession violently disputed between rival heirs supported by these different factions, the central authority of the empire simply evaporates.
It vanishes.
It happens almost overnight. The massive Tibetan military machine doesn't get defeated by an outside army. It shatters into pieces, turning inward into a brutal, exhausting civil war between rival regional generals.
And the sources give us vivid, terrifying glimpses into this collapse.
What do they say?
You see military governors who were once tasked with defending the frontiers, turning their massive armies against each other to carve out personal fiefdoms.
One of the most striking details in the sources happens in the Amdazmed region. You have these two Tibetan generals, Blan Gunbir and Zari Peipei, fighting an endless localized civil war.
Yes, a very bitter conflict.
And it's deeply personal.
Yeah.
Zari Peipei famously refuses any attempt at a truce, openly declaring of his rival, "How could I serve this dog rat?"
Dog rat is so petty but so destructive.
The empire is literally cannibalizing itself. By 866, Blan Gunbir is finally captured and executed. But by then, the war doesn't matter because there is no empire left to fight over.
It's all gone.
The vast, highly organized Tibetan colonial network has completely fragmented into dozens of isolated local mountain kingdoms.
A total collapse.
But I look at this collapse and I relate it so much to the fall of Rome.
There are a lot of parallels.
You have all the classic elements. You have barbarians at the gates, the Kyrgyz and the Uyghur refugees putting pressure on the borders.
Yes.
You have a crisis of succession triggered by internal assassination, and you have frontier generals fighting each other for power instead of defending against the enemy.
The perfect storm.
If we had to do an autopsy on this empire, did Tibet fall simply because they expanded too far? Or did they fall because they ran out of external enemies to unite them, allowing their internal factionalism to tear them apart?
I would say it was a lethal confluence of both.
Okay, how so?
The sheer economic and demographic cost of maintaining a multi-front war across the Pamirs, the Taklamakan Desert, and the Chinese frontier was ultimately unsustainable for a population base centered on the high plateau.
Just too few people trying to hold too much land.
Exactly. They severely overextended their logistical capabilities, but simultaneously, their fatal administrative flaw was that they failed to integrate the conquered territories in a way that produced lasting generational loyalty.
Ah, so when the top fell apart, the bottom just walked away.
Right. When the charismatic central authority of the emperor collapsed with Glan Dharma's assassination, there was no robust, independent bureaucratic framework to hold it together.
Like the one that often saved China during its dynastic collapses.
Exactly. Without the emperor, the military governors simply became independent warlords, and the empire dissolved.
Which brings us to the epilogue as our deep dive. The Tibetan Empire fell, yes, they faded from the geopolitical stage, but the way we remember it, or rather, the way modern history has completely failed to remember it, tells us something incredibly profound about how history is written, and more importantly, who gets to write it.
This is perhaps the most crucial paradigm-shifting takeaway from Beckwith's analysis. The source text forcefully argues against the entire conceptual framework of the Dark Ages.
Right, going back to what we said at the start.
Exactly. That concept is heavily rooted in what historians call the Pirenne thesis.
Right, named after Henri Pirenne. His argument was essentially that the early medieval period in Europe was economically isolated, impoverished, and culturally backward, specifically because the Islamic conquests of the Middle East and North Africa severed the traditional Mediterranean trade routes that Rome had relied on.
The sea was closed off.
The idea being that Europe was cut off and plunged into darkness.
Right. But Beckwith completely dismantles this Eurocentric view. He shows that Eurasia during this period was not in a dark age at all. It was highly, vibrantly connected.
The trade was still happening.
The trade routes hadn't disappeared. They had simply shifted northward and deep through Central Asia. And the Tibetan Empire was absolutely central to this global economy.
It's a completely different map.
Exactly. If you look at the 8th and 9th centuries, Charlemagne's Frankish Europe, Harun al-Rashid's Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and the Tibetan Empire in Lhasa were all cultural, economic, and military peers.
They were on the same level.
They were all participating in the same grand transcontinental exchange.
We have to stress this. Tibet wasn't just a military camp in the mountains. It was incredibly sophisticated and cosmopolitan.
Very much so.
During the 8th century, particularly under Emperor Khusran el Britson, Tibet engaged in a massive state-sponsored intellectual
The
movement.
golden age of translation.
Right. They weren't just fighting wars. They were funding scholars to translate vast, complex libraries of Sanskrit, Chinese, and Central Asian texts into the Tibetan language.
Preserving knowledge from all over.
They were actively building a highly literate, intellectually rigorous civilization that synthesized knowledge from India, China, and the Middle East.
And their economy was deeply, intrinsically integrated into global luxury trade. The world coveted Tibetan goods.
What were they trading?
Well, Arab geographers from the period consistently wrote about Tibet, and they constantly praised the unmatched quality of Tibetan products.
Like what?
Tibetan musk, for example, used for perfumes and medicines, was considered the absolute finest in the world, far superior to anything from India or China.
Musk, really?
Yeah, and their gold craftsmanship was legendary. Historical accounts describe them presenting mechanical devices made of solid, gold-intricate, moving golden animals that completely dazzled the Chinese court.
Golden mechanical animals. That's incredible.
It is. And, as we discussed regarding their military prowess, Arab writers frequently noted and praised the unbreakable bucklers, the finely crafted shields and armor of the Tibetan soldiers.
It just blows my mind the absolute chasm between the actual historical reality and our modern perception.
It's a huge disconnect.
We are taught to think of medieval Europe as isolated, and we are conditioned by popular culture to think of ancient Tibet as a realm of pacifist monks meditating in the snow.
The stereotypes run deep.
But the reality is they were driving a global economy.
Hmm.
They were dictating diplomatic terms to the Emperor of China and routing the armies of the Arab Caliph. Why has modern history done such a massive disservice to this era? How does an empire this powerful get essentially erased from our collective historical memory?
Well, it largely comes down to the biases of surviving records and the power of modern political narratives.
How so?
Because the Tibetan Empire collapsed so thoroughly into fragmented, warring states, and because later Tibetan culture, centuries later, became so intensely fundamentally focused on monastic Buddhism, the memory of their aggressive, militaristic, imperial past was actively suppressed.
By the Tibetans themselves.
Yes, or at least reinterpreted by later Tibetan historians. It just didn't fit the new national narrative of spiritual piety.
Ah, that makes sense.
Furthermore, Western historians have historically relied almost entirely on Chinese and Arabic sources to understand this period.
Right, because those were the texts they could read.
Exactly. And while those sources document Tibet's immense power, they inherently frame the Tibetans through the biased lens of the barbarian other.
It's just a problem on the border.
Right, an annoying obstacle rather than a fully realized civilization in its own right. Ultimately, modern history tends to favor the civilizations that survived in a continuous state to write the modern textbooks.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the lost superpower of the Silk Road. We have journeyed from cryptic sheepmen carved into ancient oracle bones to the cunning, ruthless statecraft of Sronbutsen-Skampo.
It's been quite a ride.
We've seen the tactical brilliance of the Murayar clan, the massive three-way Eurasian collision in the Pamir Mountains, the psychological shock of capturing Chang'an, and the tragic, inevitable collapse into civil war.
The full arc of an empire.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We began by talking about how we expect history to be clean, visible, and neatly categorized. But think about what we just learned.
It's messy.
If an empire this massive, this highly connected, and this intellectually sophisticated, an empire that literally reshaped the map of Asia, dominated the flow of the Silk Road, and repeatedly brought the mighty Tang dynasty to its knees. If an empire of that magnitude could be so entirely forgotten and rewritten by later centuries as an isolated primitive mountain kingdom.
It makes you wonder.
Exactly. What other massive world-shaping civilizations are we currently completely misunderstanding, simply because of the arbitrary borders and cultural biases of our modern history? Keep questioning what you think you know.